Hello everyone, Bhavna Gunwani this side. Today in this session we will discuss about exception handling in Java, where we're gonna cover exceptions, errors, different kind of exceptions like checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions, how to handle these kind of exceptions with the help of exception handling techniques. There are different blocks that we're going to discuss today in this exception handling, that is finally block, try block and catch block. And afterwards, I will introduce you the throw and throws keyword. So stay tuned. Thank you. Hello everyone, Bhavna Gunwani this side. Let's discuss about exception handling techniques. Exception is an event that disrupts the normal flow of the program. Basically, in Java programming or any programming language, exception handling is the process of responding to the occurrence of exceptions, which are the unwanted conditions that disturb the program execution. It is an object which is thrown at runtime. There is an exception class which has a different subclasses depending upon what kind of exception or runtime error is being thrown. I would not hesitate to say that exception is nothing but a runtime error that occurs at the execution time, at the runtime. When an exception occurs, JVM creates an exception object that identifies the exception type and tells that in which particular statement or a block of code the exception has created or occurred. Java has variant of classes to handle such exceptions, which are the built-in exceptions, or we can also create our own custom exceptions that we're going to discuss further. If you do not handle any particular exception, for example, there is a small exception that is an arithmetic exception, a number cannot be divided by 0. If you do not handle this exception at that particular stage, this is the exception message that your JVM will return with the help of exception object. As I discussed that we have different kind of exceptions like checked exceptions, unchecked exceptions. Also, there is a type error. When we talk about checked exception, occurs when something has wrong in your code and is potentially recoverable. What does that mean? That, for example, there are some exceptions which are handled or implemented by the code, and they can be resolved with the help of the developer. The program will not compile if they are not handled. That is also a kind of checked exception. For example, if you wanted to read a file from the file system and the file handling exception is a kind of checked exception, because the chances are very high that the location that you are writing in the code to access or read or write the file, maybe the file not available there, file not found there, or maybe you don't have access to read or write that file. So there is a file not found exception occurs. Chances are very high. These kind of exceptions every time needs to be handled when you write that piece of code. So checked exceptions are the exceptions that are checked at compile time by the compiler. It is mandatory to handle them. As I told you, class not found, file not found, IO exception, invocation target exception, SQL exception, all these are the checked exceptions. As I discussed, they are handled at the compile time, and these are some examples of it. We'll discuss that in very detail. There are another category that's called unchecked exception. Unchecked exceptions are the exceptions checked at runtime by JVM, as the compiler cannot check unchecked exceptions. Might you do not get any exception at runtime, so there would be a very smoother execution of the program, and compiler will not force you to handle that exception because that's not compulsory. The program with unchecked exception gets compiled successfully, but they give runtime errors if not handled. Maybe we can say that these kind of exceptions occurs due to unwanted or incorrect input that is being handled by the end user. Some unchecked exceptions are arithmetic exceptions, null pointer exception, array index, out of bound exception, number format exceptions, input mismatch exceptions, and all. We also consider there is a category called errors. The moment we talk about error, it is also an unwanted condition, exceptional condition, but it is caused due to lack of resources that you cannot handle with the help of programming by the code. Errors are irrecoverable, they cannot be handled by the programmers. Errors, for example, there is a stack overflow error. An error will arise because the stack memory is over or full already. They can occur only at runtime, and out of memory error, and all are the different kind of virtual machine error, assertions error, keyboard error, such kind of exceptions that a developer cannot handle it. So that is also you can understand, and they are also occurred at runtime. Next, we have exception class or hierarchy of exception classes. As Java is an object-oriented language, every class extends the object class. All exceptions and errors are subclasses of throwable. Throwable is the base for exceptions and errors. And as I discussed already, checked exceptions that needs to be handled at compile time, compiler enforces you to handle them. They are the IO exception, SQL exception, network exception, class not found exceptions. Unchecked exceptions which occurs at runtime and handled depending upon the requirement of the developer, arithmetic exception, null pointer exception, index out of bound exception, where it is out of bound, or string index out of bound exception occurs. Then we have errors which are not handled by the developer, that are the out of memory error, virtual memory error, and stack overflow error. These are the built-in exceptions. Depending upon your own requirements, you can also create your own custom exceptions as well. Next, I'm going to tell you that it is also subcategorized into two kind of exceptions implementations, that is asynchronous exceptions and synchronous exceptions. Any exception that deals with hardware and external problems, kind of an errors which you do not handle it with the help of programming, that are the asynchronous exceptions. Any exceptions that can be dealt with programmatic executions and implementations, that are the synchronous exceptions. You can read out certain examples here. Mouse failure you cannot handle with the coding, keyboard, motherboard failure, memory problem like a stack overflow, out of memory, power flow, and they have a super class called errors for all the asynchronous exceptions. And the synchronous exceptions I have already explained you. Checked exceptions needs to be handled at compile time forcefully. Unchecked exceptions occur at runtime, handled by the developers with the help of exception handling techniques that we're going to discuss very soon. And all are extended from the exception class, inherited from the exception class itself. These This is a piece of code where exception is getting occurred. Number 1 is 100, number 2 is 0. When I'll divide number 1 by number 2, it will say that a number cannot be divided by 0. There is an arithmetic exception is being thrown. So how we can handle it? As I discussed just now, we have a try, catch and finally block. The chances of errors are very high at this line number 9. So I'll just keep this line number 9 inside the try block. As I said that try individually does not exist. It needs to be followed by catch or finally. So I'll just write a catch block. I will use my parent class exception. As I already discussed with you, exception will be handled with the help of exception object that will contain all the information about an object. Exception object, I'll just try to write as out, sysout, exception dot get message. What is the exception message which is being given? You can see that, guys, I am not printing this result in try block. Let me just print in the result in the try block for 2 minutes. I'll just shift it later. Now when I'll just run this program, you will see that there is a very simple message is being coming, divide by 0. There is no such kind of print stack trace coming up here. You can see that we are not printing the result here, which is 0 if the number is not divisible. If I will try to do that, I can just come out of the block. I'll just write it up sysout here and we'll try to print the result which is outside the exception blocks. That's okay for the time being. I'm not writing the finally block, but it is not reachable because result is declared inside the try block. Let me just do it outside the try block. I'm going to initialize the result with 0. So if it would not be calculated and exception, because exception comes at this line, the control will goes from line number 10 to line number 12. That's what this statement will not get printed. You can also avoid it if you are writing after the blocks, and here the result gets printed. That would be 0. Let's try to run and see. So here you can get the result 0. You can also write this remaining piece of code under the finally block, because whether the exception will occur or not, finally is a block that always be executed. I'll tell you what other piece of code you can write down here. So you can see that still it gets printed, but if an exception does not occur, let's say here I'm writing 10. So the try block will execute, and after that immediately the finally block gets executed. Try catch will be completely skipped. I hope you got a complete idea how does this try, catch and finally works. Moreover, examples coming up soon. Until next time, stay tuned. Thank you.